So here we have representation from both industry as well as academia, and it's on purpose because many of the trials that lead to drug approvals, of course, need to go through an industry partner, but they're run at academic centers. So there's truly a partnership between a pharmaceutical biotech company and a principal investigator. We are really interested in your perspectives, being treating clinicians, medical scientists, as well as being someone who's now stepped away from academia, Dr. Katz, and leading a large program from one of the most interesting biotech companies in the transplant space, Eledon Pharmaceuticals. And Ken Newell, you're leading the group at Emory School of Medicine, where you're a surgeon and you're doing a tremendous number of transplants there, and also interesting treatment programs. And we heard about belatacept, for example. So I'd like to first start just a few words about yourselves. I've made some of the introduction already, but maybe a little bit about your passion for this space, and then we can move into the questions. If we start with Dr. Newell.
I was going to defer. So my name's Ken Newell. I'm a transplant surgeon, trained in Chicago, practiced most of my life at Emory in Atlanta. I've been interested in tolerance, mechanisms of controlling the immune response, things like that for most of my life. What drew me into transplant as a specialty is it combines science and medicine, and if you're a surgeon, surgery. So it seemed the best of all. And when I started, and this will resonate with you, we had so many drugs that needed to be evaluated that we couldn't figure out how to do them. We didn't have enough patients. And it was like you were a kid in a candy shop, and everybody was thinking about new ways to combine medicines, use them more effectively, minimize side effects. And we've gone from that to, as you said, not a novel therapeutic approved since 2011. I mean, we went from thinking that we would have, like cancer, we'd have all sorts of drugs to choose from to try to optimize them for the individual patient, to now we're pretty much doing the same thing that I've been doing for the last 15 years or so. And so I think my passion comes from getting to know patients and understanding that although we say it's great, kidney's working wonderful at a year. As a friend of mine said, when you see a family that comes in and their daughter needs a lung transplant, and you say the odds of this working well at a year are pretty good. High school, yeah, there's a shot we'll get through high school. College, yeah, that's not unreasonable to expect. Marriage, children, grandchildren, that's not, unless you move right along, that's not going to happen. So I think we need to expect more. And my late colleague, Dan Solomon, was the first one to tell me this. We were so proud of our outcomes because we kept talking about 1 year. And he said, this is like a diagnosis of cancer. It may not kill you today, but it's not a normal life. And we have to be advocates for better. So that's kind of how I got to where I am.
Thank you. Dr. Katz.
Thank you. So I think that one of the difference between us, maybe the others, that I cannot say that I spend most of my life here or there because I moved so much. So I don't remember where I started, when I end. I'm from Israel. I trained as a surgeon in Israel. I came to the United States, trained as a transplant surgeon. I was doing for quite many years liver transplantation mainly, but also kidneys and pancreases. And then I crossed the black screen between academia and industry and went to industry. And in the last almost 17, 18 years in industry, I spent mainly working on the areas of immunology and transplantation. I was lucky enough to be involved in developing drugs from the beginning up to the approval by the FDA. I spent about 2 years ago, I spent a year at eGenesis as a chief medical officer and kind of get a sense of where we are and where we should go as far as xenotransplantation. And then I was excited to come back to Eledon and work on a drug that actually started to be developed 20 years ago and then stopped because of some complication that we may talk about it or not, but It just shows you how difficult sometimes it is to develop drugs, but few pharmaceutical companies were able to address this issue with the complication. And now we have a series of new drugs similar to the one developed in Eledon that actually are developing now in multiple autoimmunity disease like Sjögren's syndrome, just a published study in multiple sclerosis and others. And we are, of course, hoping to develop it in transplantation. The first study in this drug was done about, as I said, 20 years ago by Dr. Alan Kirk, who is now in Duke, who was leading at that time the effort to develop this so-called new drug. For 20 years, there was a delay. Now we are continuing. We can talk about it.
Thank you. So question to you. I mentioned earlier there were 13 drugs approved in cancer last year, and there has been one in transplantation in the past 30. So is it because we're bad at developing drugs in transplantation, or is it because the regulatory pathways are complicated?
So if I may, one thing I think it's really important, or I at least think it's important, is to acknowledge and respect the role of the FDA in our health system. This agency is supposed to make sure of the safety of the patients. And the only way, or the main way they're looking at any development of any drug or any device is through the perspective of safety of the patients. So I know there's a lot of us, and many times we are going against the regulations. We need to understand where they're coming from. And if we want to be successful, we need to come forward with programs of development that are safe and they can meet what the agency, I think rightly so, demand us to do.
So let me interrupt you though, because the agency right now requires 2 phase 3 trials with as a primary endpoint graft survival at 1 year. And currently we've heard from several speakers that that's very, very high right now with the current drug, tacrolimus. So is there a need for a secondary or a surrogate endpoint that could be considered?
Of course they need, and I'll be the main advocate for that, but it needs to be done in a way, and that is our responsibility, and when I say ours, it's the transplant community and the patients, to put forward in front of the agency a plan that is based on data, on science, and convince them. And Dr. Cohen presented the belatacept data, right? And you saw that was something very interesting that now is being talked about for the last few meetings that I was in the last few years, that rejection happened early on, but it does not seem to affect long-term graft or patient survival, and with much better kidney function. So why we are paying so much attention to the rejection in the first year after transplantation? If we develop the argument based on all the data we have to come forward as a transplant community, maybe we need to change the endpoint for clinical trial, because rejection in the first year.
But isn't that what the TTC has been trying to do for a number of years?
They're trying to do for a number of years.
Let's hear from Dr. Newell.
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is it does set up an adversarial relationship between the transplant community and the FDA. And we talk about the FDA as if it's a thing. The FDA is a group of different disease-focused organizations, and they're very different. So one difference is that the Division of Rheumatology and Transplantation is not the same as the division that oversees cancer. So you might have one that is somewhat more risk-taking than the other. And we talk about it as if it's a thing. And first we have to get to know the people and understand their comfort points and where they're uncomfortable. I think the second thing that I was told early on by the FDA is we don't propose new ideas. You bring us new ideas and we'll tell you whether or not those ideas work. And the strength of the data determines how quickly they move and what they decide. I would say, though, that there's a certain degree of risk aversity there. You know, no one wants to approve something that's harmful. As you said, that's a kind of showstopper. If I come up with a new therapy and I do it on the first 20 patients and it doesn't work, as happened to Tom Starzl, even though in the end it works, he changed jobs because that's, you know, not tolerable. And so I think that if you look at, and this was pointed out to me by a patient who's also a very strong advocate, we're using an endpoint that was developed back in the early 1980s. The rate of acute rejection was like 90%. 1-year graft survival was 50%. Those were meaningful measures at that time. They no longer are meaningful measures. I mean, if they're terrible, yes, but they're not. As we heard, the outcomes now at 1 year are excellent. We moved beyond that. We have to help the FDA understand that. I was going to say that the only path forward that I see, they're not going to listen to me. They're very entrenched in where they are. If they're using an endpoint that, if you go back, and most of you may not remember 1984, I remember I had a car. It didn't have anti-lock brakes. It had a cigarette lighter and an ashtray. I mean, we're still using those tools in transplant today. And I think we have to help them understand. And the only way I see is similar to, and I think Dr. Montgomery was involved in this, lobbying for the HOPE Act, where patients came forward. And it's not up to the FDA to decide what's acceptable risk, really. I took one of my less well-conceived ideas. I decided that it would be great to have a motorcycle. So I went, and my friend said, you got to take the rider safety course. Before that, I went and spent about $1,000 buying riding gear because it looked so cool. I sat down, and the first thing the guy said to me is, let's understand something about risk to our class. He said, riding will never be as safe as driving. Driving will never be as safe as taking the bus. I'm here to help you minimize risk, but you have to decide how much risk you will take. He didn't ask my parents. He didn't ask my employers. I think patients have to be very vocal with the FDA in saying, this is what we expect transplant to offer us. And these are the risks we're willing to take. And it's okay for you to help us understand risk. And we realize you have to provide for a certain degree of safety, but let us have a say in our own treatment. That seems...
But that goes back to what Dr. Goldstein said earlier, is that different patients may have different tolerance to risk.
But so what I'm saying is you can accept these different risks. And you and I, you probably don't own a Harley Davidson.
No, and I will never.
Yes, and so you have done the risk calculation. You said the fun for me.
I also don't look good in that kind of gear.
If he would say that the benefit to the risk doesn't work, it might work for me. And we can do the same with almost every activity in life. It's about understanding risk balance. But the FDA is right now doing what we in medicine have been taught not to do, being very paternalistic.
So
Dr. Montgomery made some choices in his transplant path that at the time were a bit on the edge. He was comfortable with those risks. He understood, he decided. That doesn't mean
But that goes to
everybody
the
would.
point of education. Go ahead, Dr.
If I
Katz.
may, I'm not here, of course, to protect the FDA. I mean, I'm working, but I learned to work with them. And throughout my 17 years of drug development, I found out that the only way to move things forward is to work with them and not create adversary relationship with them. Excuse me, let me just finish. I was sitting in front of the transplant division about 3 or 4 years ago, presented them a study that never done before, combination of belatacept and CD40 ligand in 20 patient kidney transplantation de novo. They agreed, approve it. We're sitting in front of them to do a desensitization study before the COVID with CD40 ligand blocker and B-cell depleter. They listened to us, they agreed. I was in front of them arguing about endpoint, about a rare neurological disease when I was in MedImmune. They listened to us back and forth, and then we come to agreement and we move forward. The only thing I'm saying, we need to understand what their obligations are, what they worried about, and we need to address this worry and try to create with them relationship. The same thing with the xenotransplantation. They conducted, you remember, 2 years ago, a 2 days symposium on xeno to try to understand the community. Then they have what you mentioned, I think, Bob, the patient day that they had about a few months ago or the end of last year to listen to patients on dialysis and why they believe xeno may be a solution. So the only thing I'm saying, if we want to move forward, all of us need to move together. And if we have good data, to come to the agency, not to accept what they're saying, but to present data that can convince them that we are on the right track and we need to change direction. And I think and we are now facing it in a real time, because what we want to do is to try to convince the agency maybe to change the endpoint to allow us to move forward in a phase 3 study in a different way.
Yep.
Time will remain to be seen if it's going to happen or not. We have the iBox now, which is a new way to look at long-term outcome. So that's the only thing I'm saying here. We need to work with them and
Yeah.
not against them.
I think we're all saying the same thing. We're saying that we need to modify perhaps and expedite the pathways, but we need to do it together
Yeah.
and in a fact-based manner. And because of new technology where we can gather large data sets and maybe do some work in silico versus doing a lot of prospective clinical trials, it may be the time.
Yeah, and one thing, if I may, just to add, just a story about the patient power. So when I was at Pfizer, I was involved in our drug, actually the one that you heard about, the sirolimus, was tested in investigation study by one investigator in Cincinnati in a very rare disease that's called Lyme disease, which is affecting lungs of young women and cause them to die or to need a lung transplantation. The study was done by one investigator, randomized control study on 86 patients. When I saw the data that was about to send to New England Journal of Medicine, I said, this probably is a basis to approval because there's nothing there and it's a very devastating disease. Pfizer at that time was not so keen to go forward for all kinds of reasons. That is part of what we're talking about here, the motivation of big company to go for these kind of small diseases. What the patient organization did, and I worked with them for a long time, they submit a patient petition to the FDA about that study and about the fact they want this drug to be approved for this disease. Then the FDA approached Pfizer, we had a lot of discussion, and eventually the drug was approved based on this study, based on this patient action, and the drug is now being used in about 20 countries to treat this disease. So patient organization is powerful organization. And I think you need to use this power in a wise way, but I think you can affect a lot of what's going on. So go ahead.
Excellent comment on that.
Oh, I think we're saying the same thing with
Yeah.
slightly different emphasis.
Yep.
What I would say is we have to have, the medical community has to provide data to help the FDA get to a yes. We can't just wander in and say, this sounds like a really good idea. I tried it a few times, and this should be a new endpoint.
Right.
I think that the real change, though, and we were at a meeting, Kevin, I think, wrote a paper about this. You know, the FDA had, was it 6 meetings, you know, soliciting input about changing endpoints and expediting drug development. And I think Kevin said, we just had another meeting and we keep having meetings, but yet nothing has changed. I think at some point we have to expect change. I mean, it's a reasonable expectation, and all change carries some risk. And I think where the patients come forward is saying, we expect change, but this help us understand we're willing to accept a little more risk than you're giving us credit for. Some people, yes, not everybody. But I think that we've kind of stalled for years. The professional societies spoke for patients without ever asking what the patients thought. And we thought we were doing pretty good. 1-year graft survival is good and this and that. But if you look at it based on surveys that are starting to be done now, people are disappointed in the long-term outcome. And there have even been studies done to suggest that sometimes, life is not preferable to it. Yeah, death is not worse than a bad life in some settings. And so I think that the FDA really needs to help us. I mean, I think everybody in this room, you included, would say one drug in a field like transplant, basically, I mean, there was tacrolimus and then some kind of very similar drugs.
Yeah.
And then there was belatacept, and that's 20, 30 years.
So let me remind you, and this is another topic or another point I want to make. Let me remind the story of tafasitamab. Remember the JAK3 inhibitor? I was at Pfizer. We finished phase 2 with JAK3 inhibitor, tafasitamab. Great drug that actually can have a very good anti-rejection action without all the side effects, like we talked today, of calcineurin inhibition. The team was very excited. We're writing the phase 3, want to go forward. Pfizer say, stop. We actually want to take this drug and move it to autoimmunity. We don't want to develop it in transplantation. I brought in 2 occasions, the 2 presidents at that time of the AST and ASTS, the 2 transport organizations, the 2 presidents, to meet with the Pfizer leadership, sitting in the room, try to convince them there is unmet need. There are patients who need this drug. Keep doing your autoimmunity, but let us continue transplantation. Pfizer says no. And the point I want to make, that many companies, many large company and mid-sized company and some small company have no appetite financially, and you like it or not, drug development is driven by money. And any drug development, any device development, pharmaceutical industry is driven by money. That's the reality. Many other parts of our life driven by money also. But so when Pfizer make a business decision to go to another area, this drug never was had a chance in transplantation.
So it would be very interesting to look at the number of drugs in autoimmunity that could be applied to transplantation, and look at also what we have discovered in oncology and see if we can reverse some of that into transplantation and autoimmunity. So, but to do so, we need to expand the number of organs that can be used, because then we will expand the market tremendously.
Of course,
Yeah.
you need, look, I mean, you heard today, I mean, the solution so-called for transplantation is multi-level, you know. Organ, you need to solve the organ issue. You need to resolve the better immunosuppression, maybe tolerance, all other issues that you need to be resolved to overall take it forward.
Yeah. Okay. One
I
more
was gonna say
comment.
one
Yeah.
last thing. I think the current endpoint, again, to go back to how archaic it is. So, and you'll remember this, but the original approval of cyclosporin, which transformed our field, was based on what, 250 patients.
Yeah.
You could never do that today. But that's because the problem was so common, 90% rejection rate. It halved it. That was
Yeah.
impressive.
Yep.
Rejection rates now in kidney are 8%.
Right.
If I have that, now I'm at 4%. You can't measure an impact on outcome. It's meaningless. And
Yeah.
death and graft loss, fortunately, are even less problems. So we're now using an endpoint that is so rare, it's impossible to do a
Can I
study.
describe my challenge in moving forward with
But-
the drug? with
but
the
let-
drug?
let
What
us-
I would say
So,
is,
Dr.
with
Nolan,
that
Dr.
current
Yeah.
endpoint,
Just
it will be
before-
virtually
Before you go
impossible to ever do
further,
a
I
study.
think we have a lot of individuals both listening and in person who might not fully understand this primary endpoint and what is a surrogate endpoint. Because I think what you're describing here is the problem with the 1-year graft survival, where we have such a good success with tacrolimus, not taking into account patient-reported outcomes, meaning side effects and so on. Just look at the hard endpoint. If we could come up with something that would show within that year, that also shows a significant, predictive value of what this kidney would look like 5 to 10 years later. And that's what the iBox is attempting to do. Could you just explain, one of you, explain that so that, or maybe I did, but I think it is very important for everyone to understand that we can't just look at doing suddenly 5 to 10-year trials, because no company will do that. We need to find these endpoints that predict future success.
So again, each division within the FDA is different. Cancer has,
Right.
I think half of the drugs approved in cancer have been approved on what's called a surrogate endpoint, or reasonably likely surrogate. That's something that you can measure that predicts future outcome. And so, it becomes very difficult. Belatacept was in clinical development for what, over a decade before it was approved. And if I recall right, your patent rights start to expire from the beginning of the clinical trials. So, not only does it cost tons of money, the data collections owners, but it takes forever to do these studies, eating into patent rights and financial returns, which are real considerations for companies. So the goal is to come up with something that predicts an outcome. I can look at hemoglobin A1C, and even though my blood sugar may be normal, it tells me something about what might happen down the road. So we want an early indicator. And so a tool's been developed called the iBox, and it looks at things like your kidney function, what a biopsy looks like, proteinuria, whether you have donor-specific antibodies, all of which everyone in transplant knows are predictors of outcome. It weights them differently using machine learning, and you can measure this at a year, and it's a quite accurate predictor, more accurate than things like KDPI we talk about, or EPTS. It's more accurate than those. at predicting outcomes at 5, even out to 7 years. So the goal would be, can you do a study and at 1 year, you do the iBox and you say, does my therapeutic intervention improve the iBox prediction of a longer term outcome?
Yep.
There's a worry that that could be wrong, but the safety net here is that you follow those people and you actually see, does it work at 5 years? Does the iBox prediction hold true? If so, the approval's withdrawn and the drug's no longer approved. If, however, it works, you've been able to market that drug for an extra 4 or 5 years. And it's also a much more powerful tool because, as I said, death and graft loss and rejection are the current measures. Those are so rare that statistically speaking, you just need massive trials. The iBox has much greater discrimination, and there's actually a power calculator that the TTC came up with to help companies say, how many patients would we need to enroll to hit a statistically meaningful endpoint? It's a much smaller group. So that's the type of innovation I'm hoping to see come, but it won't come from medical professionals talking to the FDA because the unmet need isn't perceived. It will come from patients talking to the FDA saying, we need something better. And if it's not the iBox, we need something.
I
Yeah.
think what you just mentioned remind me of something, we often, yeah, sure. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
We often go to the agency to different discussion, critical discussion, industry, and we bring some of the medical community with us, expert in the field. I think we need to start thinking about bringing patient representative with us to this meeting because this is another voice that needs to be heard in this discussion, and this can be helpful. I think there's as I said, I really believe there's a power to the patient that we are not utilizing and we should utilize in
Well,
different ways.
Well, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And I think that some of the success stories have brought patients to the FDA. I remember well getting approved for a drug for age-related macular degeneration, and we had patients who were blind, speaking to the FDA. So yes, I think it's a great idea. Thank you both. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.